The Arab revolt is gathering steam in Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh is responding with full force. Stay with News Analysis as we ask how serious the protests have become and whether Saudi Arabia's Western allies are prepared to stay at its side in the face of this storm.
Overnight clashes in Awamiya in the eastern Qatif region. On one side, security forces armed with armoured vehicles and weapons. On the other, peaceful protesters armed only with anti-regime slogans and stones. Rights activists say over 24 people were injured in the clashes. However, the Interior Ministry has put the number at 14. The state television has quoted the ministry as saying in a statement that the unrest in the eastern province was stirred by, quote, a foreign country.
قامت مجموعة من مثيري الفتنة والشقاق والشغب في بلدة العوامية بمحافظة القطيف بالتجمع بالقرب من دوار الريف في العوامية، والبعض منهم باستخدام دراجات نارية بإعاز من دولة خارجية تسعى للمساس بأمن الوطن واستقراره، ويعتبر تدخلا سافرا في السيادة الوطنية.
The protests in the area erupted after security forces detained a 70-year-old man whose son had participated in anti-regime protests. They demanded the son surrender himself in exchange for his father's release. Demonstrators have vowed to keep up their, quote, intifada until the siege on Awamiya is broken. The demonstrations come despite a ban on all kinds of protests and public gatherings. The protesters' demands are clear. They urge authorities to respect basic human rights, allow freedom of expression, release political prisoners, and carry out a wide range of reforms. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, known for its intolerance of dissent. Human Rights Watch says hundreds of dissidents have been arrested since February as part of the Saudi government's suppression of anti-regime protests. Saudi-based Human Rights First Society says the detainees have been tortured. A bid to try to move the world's attention from the country's tarnished rights record, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia joined the international community to heap pressure on the government of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But when it came to neighbouring Bahrain, Riyadh sent columns of its armed forces there to help Manama in cracking down on peaceful protests. Increasing pressure on other countries such as Syria and Libya, the United States, a traditional ally of the Al Saud, has kept mum on Riyadh's violations of human rights both at home and abroad. But analysts believe it's the will of the Saudi that will prevail at the end, no matter how hard the US and other countries try to keep Al Saud in place.
Well, joining us now live from London is Mr. Ali Al-Kabani, journalist and political analyst in Beirut, Middle East expert Omar Nashabi, and joining us via Skype from Colorado, human rights lawyer Paul Wolf. I'd like to welcome you all to this edition of News Analysis, and I'll start my first question in London. Mr. Kabani, what do you think about the way Riyadh is handling these protests? It's using security forces at the same time making political announcements.
Of course, what Riyadh is doing is typical of a dictatorship and tyranny, because they are using the iron fist which they have been ruling the Arab Peninsula for decades. We can see their hypocrisy also and double-faced policy. They are supporting with some other sheikdoms of the Gulf the uprising in Libya, and they are using their propaganda machine to attack the regime in Syria. But when it came to Bahrain, their front door, or in Yemen, the backyards, they are sending troops to fight the people of these two countries. We know that they send Dar al-Jazeera to Bahrain, and we knew before they sent their army to kill and fight the Houthis in Saada. So it's not surprising that they are using the same iron fist and the security apparatus to destroy their people in the eastern province. Especially also we know that most of the Saudi Shiite live in Qatif and the eastern province in general, and there is discrimination against their Shiite brothers there in Saudi Arabia. And I read recently actually a very good article by a Saudi writer called Al-Wa'ili criticizing the discrimination against the Shiite, and they are saying that they are not patriotic because they have got the references Al-Maraja outside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So he told them, you don't allow them to have their schools, you don't allow them to have their own marja in the country, and then you criticize them of having their fatwas from outside.
Right.
So he said that the Shia should have equal rights as the Sunni in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of Saudi intellectuals actually are now against the iron fist policy of the king there.
All right, you're referring, Mr. Kabani, to the problems that Shias are facing, and of course we know, Mr. Omar Nashabi, I'll put this next question to you. We know that the protests are specifically taking place in the eastern province, in Qatif, Awamiyah, where the Shias are. But speaking of the popular demands of Saudi Arabia as an entire country, when we're speaking of the political repression, women's rights, the system of governance, now do you think the changes that have been proposed in Saudi Arabia can bring the changes that people would want? Or do you think that the system of governance there is too deeply rooted in the foundation of the state that even if it wants to bring any change, that would mean that the Saudi rulers would undermine their own authority?
Yes, I don't think there were any substantial changes. The show that the king put a week ago about women's rights was just a very shallow move forward towards democracy. There are no changes, no reforms towards democracy in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps Saudi Arabia has one of the poorest and the weakest human rights records in the whole area. And perhaps there's a third guest who's an expert on human rights. He can expand on that point. But I just want to point to one central element is that, well, it happens to be that this is taking place in a region that is predominantly inhabited by Saudi Shiite. But however, as you pointed, this does not mean that this is a sectarian uprising. This is a popular uprising, apparently. And this is a sign perhaps for more actions that will take place in the future in other regions inside Saudi Arabia. However, this is a big challenge, and I was surprised that the video footage was leaked, because I know how aggressive the security forces are in Saudi Arabia and how difficult it is to get anything or any information out of Saudi Arabia, and that is to be compared with other countries where there were some troubles, where the videos were out by the hundreds or the thousands and they were published on the internet. It is very scarce and very difficult to find any videos or any information on the internet or anywhere else about what's happening in Saudi Arabia. It's less than any other country, although these other countries are smaller, are weaker, are poorer, perhaps they have less resources. In Saudi Arabia, with all the resources, I think it's very difficult to get something out. I mean, and I'm really surprised, and I think that we should have more of these videos, more information from inside Saudi Arabia. Well, the reaction of the Saudi authorities was a typical reaction, accusing other countries by actually showing, trying to create this illusion that there is intervention in Saudi affairs to deflect from other issues elsewhere, especially in Syria. That was a typical reaction. And the other reaction is accusing the protesters of carrying weapons. And I can see from the pictures that there are no weapons. And also the third tactic is to decrease the number of wounded. Whereas the number was reported to be 24, the Saudis said, and the statement by by the Saudi officials said that there were only 14.
Right, I'd just like to stop you there, Mr. Nashabi, if I may. Let's just bring in Mr. Paul Wolf on this before we continue with the discussion. Mr. Wolf, Riyadh has been saying that it will allow women to take part in politics, but at the same time, these same women, if they're candidates for municipal office, for instance, they must present a written authorization from their husbands. Women voters must be accompanied by their guardians, male guardians at the polling stations. So when we are again speaking of the type of reforms that the Saudi kingdom may try to bring, is this going to be the answer for these protests? Or as I was just mentioning earlier, are reforms completely or simply impossible with the system of absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia?
Well, no, I don't think that the protests are specifically about women's rights. I think that the Saudi monarchy has taken a number of steps, including paying $2,000 to each citizen, providing loans for either education or to start businesses to Saudi young people, a number of measures like this to try to prevent the kind of thing that we've seen in Bahrain, in Yemen, and in Libya. And the women's rights issue is only one. You know, I'd like to follow up on what your previous guest said. In Saudi Arabia, cell phones with cameras are illegal. All telephone conversations are monitored. The government controls the TV and the print media. And the time supposed to be an election was in 2009. That election was canceled. So the Saudis, they have legitimate right and self-determination to demand right to vote, to demand the right of free speech. Those rights are guaranteed by treaties that Saudi Arabia has signed. As a member of the United Nations, it had to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and a number of other treaties. So, I mean, it's great if they're taking action to try to include women in the political process, but really no one is included in the political process. The Saudi monarchy has been in power for many generations, and I mean, just look at the Saudi king. Do you think that that is a type of person who could be elected? The man is 87 years old, and really, I think that the situation is extremely disturbing in Saudi Arabia. I don't like to advocate any kind of violence, but I think that that the protesters, they have to demand these rights. They have to be out in the streets, and it's probably likely that some people will be hurt or even lose their lives, as we've seen in many other countries in the Middle East. Right,
Mr. Wolf, let's just stop you there. Go back to London, Mr. Kabani. Speaking of the type of state that's currently in place in Saudi Arabia, a lot of analysts would say that they wouldn't even consider it a state. The rule of a single family, they say, with the legislative, with executive and with judicial powers. No state budget, practically the country being the private domain of a single royal family. Not strictly speaking, they say, a country, but simply a part of Arabia that belongs to a single family. So does all this make Saudi Arabia, however, a fragile system?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia's regime is very fragile. The wind of change are blowing towards the Gulf area. We shouldn't fool ourselves about all these steps which the king declared. The regime in Saudi Arabia is an autocratic regime. Even men don't have a political rights, let alone women, because we all know that Majlis al-Shura, the consultative council, is all its members are appointed by the king, and this new step that women will be included, they will also be appointed, so they will be crony of the regime. The other thing is, even inside the royal family itself, there is no democracy. So it's autocratic. The only person who is ruling is the king, and no one else can interfere. The king said, even with this step of appointing a number of women in the consultative council, that he consulted the scholars and the clergymen in his country, and we saw that a number of prominent members of them, they said the king didn't consult us, and we were not consulted in all this. It's not that they are objecting, but even the king is not telling the truth and he is trying to show himself as democratic,
well, Mr.
and
Kabani,
he consult other people and take consultation.
If you do agree, Mr. Kabani, that this is a fragile system, a fragile regime, what has kept it running for all this time? Is it just the Western support that it's getting that's actually making Saudi Arabia stand up as it has without any disruption, without any protests up until now, with the Arab Spring that it's come, of course, for all those years? What has kept it in power then?
It is the deal between King Abdulaziz and the Americans, that they protect his throne and he follow the dictates which they instruct him to do. And Abdulaziz and all his successors have been following this policy. The throne is protected by the United States, and they are following the American policy, and they are doing whatever the American ask them to do. But of course it has got a limit. It cannot carry on forever like that, because the people in Saudi Arabia are now more educated, especially the youth of Saudi Arabia, and they will not accept this autocratic dictatorship anymore. Of course, it will take time, but it will happen. The other thing, internally, they are using...
Kabani,
no, this is an important point. They are also using the checkbook policy to try to give their subjects, because the people in Saudi Arabia are not citizens, they are subjects to Wali al-Amr, the king, so they are giving them money to keep them quiet.
Okay. Mr. Nashabi, do you think, however, then, the Saudi regime right now can rely on the US and the Western support to face this storm, to face these protests? Do you think that this support will help it not to fall?
Well, let's wait. Let's wait till the coming days and see how this will turn out. I mean, it's still a bit early to actually judge if this is going to be successful or not. However, I have to actually point out to the dimension of this. If a change in Saudi Arabia is in fact a change towards democracy, towards freedom, is a turning point in modern Islamic history. And it is at the same time a turning point in world economics. Because Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, there is the holy places in Islam, Mecca and Medina, and therefore this is a place where Muslims from all around the world come as pilgrimage every year. Millions of Muslims. If this is going to be a democracy, this will have a tremendous impact on the Islamic world as a whole. That's one. And the second point is that Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. And if there's going to be a democracy, a parliament, a voting system, freedom of expression, freedom of association, this is really going to be a marking moment in world history. And therefore, I think that this will push the Americans and other Western forces and some Arab forces also in the region to interfere in Saudi Arabia in a very strong way to support the ruling monarchy, the ruling dictators, to actually crush any attempt to succeed in any change in Saudi Arabia. And I think there will be no limits to the violence and the aggression that the Saudi authorities can use to stop any attempt to change towards democracy.
Right, Paul Wolf, let's put this question to you. On the other hand, some analysts have been saying that, in fact, the West may be speculating right now on the collapse of the Saudi regime and even planning beforehand on it. Some saying that it's rather the interests of the two sides, meaning Riyadh and Washington, are now diverging. The US would rather use the gas reserves of the African region and start to part ways from Saudi Arabia. Would you agree with that speculation?
Well, I don't know where that comes from. What the United States will often do in these situations is make contacts and support both sides. That's certainly what happened in Egypt. And, I'm sure that we had contacts in Libya as well, because we just don't know which way things are going to go. So I am not surprised that someone is planning what would the United States do if the Saudi monarchy were to fall. But I think that the United States is going to do as it did in Egypt, back the Saudis until the very last minute. The United States is dependent on Saudi Arabia for something like 20% of its oil, and that's very significant. Saudi Arabia has also been an air base, really, for the U.S. war in Iraq, and Saudi Arabia is the United States' most important Arab ally, and the United States could not really afford to lose control of that area. And particularly, as your other guest said, Mecca and Medina are in Saudi Arabia. It's really crucially important to the future of the Muslim world, what happens in Saudi Arabia. So the United States is certainly going to plan for the contingency that the monarchy may fall. But I think the United States will also do whatever it can to try to prevent that from happening. So let's hope that this can happen without violence, because as we've seen in Tunisia and in Egypt, if the dictators step down voluntarily, things get better. Maybe not at the rate that everyone wants, but I think they are moving towards democracy in those countries. But as we've seen in Yemen, Bahrain, and in Libya, when they use force to try to crush the protests, the result is an ongoing conflict, and many lives will be lost. And we still don't know how the situations in any of those countries are going to turn out.
Mr. Kabani, let's have your take on that as well. Do you think that Washington and Riyadh are now seriously concerned about this Arab Spring spreading into Saudi Arabia and how that will change the situation there? And also, is this alleged US-Saudi counter-revolution attempt working when we speak of course, the Bahrain intervention, the Yemen intervention, and the same forces you said being used in Saudi Arabia?
I think I agree with your guest in the U.S., Mr. Paul Wolf, that the American administration will always play on the two lines. They are going to support the regime of Saudi Arabia to the end, and at the same time they will open channel with the protesters. Of course, the protest movement is at its initial stages, and again, we don't know how the outcome will be. But I think these are the first steps, and they will carry on. As for the Saudi regime, they should realize that the American administration actually would throw their puppet in the first history dustbin they face, like they did with Saddam Hussein and Mubarak of Egypt and Gaddafi of Libya. So they will do the same with the ruler of Saudi Arabia if they think the protest took momentum and the change is going to happen. So no one actually in his right mind would among the rulers should and would rely on the American administration to support him, because they never support dictators and tyrannies. They use them to the last moment, but when they are burned off, they try to appoint another puppet to serve their interests and to accept their dictates.
Okay.
But hopefully this time that the Arab Spring will change this formula.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. A big thank you there to Mr. Ali Al-Kabani, journalist and political analyst in London. In Beirut, Middle East expert Mr. Omar Nashabi, and via Skype from Colorado, human rights lawyer Paul Wolf. Thanks so much for staying with us on this edition of News Analysis from me, Homa Lesgi. Until our next program.